What if your greatest achievement, the thing you were most celebrated for, was also the source of your deepest, most crushing regret? Well, for the chemist, Otto Hahn, that wasn't just some thought experiment. It was the absolute reality of his life's work. This is the story of the man who discovered nuclear fission and how that incredible discovery led not to a celebration, but to a moment of pure, devastating shock.
So, picture this. It's 1945. The war in Europe has finally ended. But for 10 of Germany's absolute top nuclear physicists who are being held as prisoners in a quiet English country house, a whole different battle is just about to kick off. They have no idea, but they're about to hear a piece of news that is going to completely shatter their world.
On that evening, their British captors, who by the way were secretly recording every single word, drop a bombshell. They tell them an atomic bomb has just been used on Hiroshima. And these men, the very minds behind Germany's nuclear program, are suddenly forced to confront a reality that they honestly believed was impossible. The reaction is instantaneous, and for one man, it is absolutely devastating. That man is Otto Hahn, the chemist who started it all, the one who actually discovered nuclear fission, and he is just shattered. He feels the weight of every single life lost, and he even admits to his captors that he thought about suicide when he first realized the terrifying power he had unlocked. The other scientists, their first reaction is just pure disbelief. Werner Heisenberg, a Nobel laureate and the head of the whole German project, he just dismisses it completely. He thinks it's a bluff. In his mind, there was just no way anyone could have solved all the massive technical problems that quickly. Then you have another physicist, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker. He's just as skeptical, but for, slightly different reasons. He can't even wrap his head around the idea that it's based on uranium fission. The whole room is just this storm of denial and confusion as these brilliant men try to process how they could have been so wrong and so completely beaten. And this really brings us to the core of the story, doesn't it? Who was this man, Otto Hahn? And what exactly had he discovered that could earn him a Nobel Prize on one hand and a soul-crushing sense of guilt on the other? To understand that, we have to go back to where it all began. So let's turn back the clock. We're leaving the shock of 1945 behind and stepping into the quiet of a Berlin laboratory. Here, in the years just before the war, the pursuit of knowledge was, pure. And the very nature of the atom itself was about to be totally redefined. Science is all about building on what came before, one step at a time. First, you had Rutherford, who came up with the idea of the atom's tiny, dense nucleus. Then Chadwick discovered the neutron, this amazing particle with no charge that could be used like a perfect little bullet to poke at that nucleus. And all of that set the stage for 1938, when Otto Hahn and his colleague Fritz Strassmann ran an experiment that would, literally, change the world. What they did was they bombarded uranium with these neutrons, and they were expecting to create heavier elements. But instead, they found barium, which is an element about half the size of uranium. At first, they were just completely baffled. But the conclusion was inescapable. They had actually split the atom. And this process, which we now call nuclear fission, released a simply staggering amount of energy. Now, looking at this notation gives you a sense of just how complex the physics was. But you have to remember, for Hahn and his peers, this wasn't about building a weapon at all. It was just a beautiful, fascinating academic puzzle. They were simply trying to understand the fundamental building blocks of the universe, driven by pure scientific curiosity. And right there, that's the terrifying paradox. The science was incredibly intricate, but its application, that was brutally simple. Fission made a chain reaction possible. One split atom could trigger another, which triggers another and another, unleashing exponential energy in a fraction of a second. This was the blueprint for a bomb. In Hahn, he understood this terrifying potential almost immediately. Even before the war started, before a bomb was even a reality, he was so horrified by the implications of his own work that he seriously considered this really drastic idea, to hide the key to this incredible power from humanity forever. Which brings us right back to that room in Farm Hall. As these scientists are reeling from the news about Hiroshima, there's one massive question hanging in the air. If a German chemist made the key discovery, why in the world was it the Americans who actually built the bomb? Well, when you put the two projects side by side, the difference is just staggering. It's not even a fair fight. The German uranium project was this small, underfunded effort, and it was often looked at with suspicion by the Nazi regime. The American Manhattan Project, on the other hand, was an industrial giant, a behemoth, employing nearly 200,000 people with the full, unquestioning backing of the entire U.S. government. If you listen to the secret transcripts from that night, you hear different explanations start to bubble up. Heisenberg, for example, argues that they just couldn't even imagine a project on that kind of scale. He says they lacked what he called the moral courage to go to the German government and ask for such a mind-boggling investment in a weapon they weren't even sure they could build in time. But then Weizsäcker offers up a much more controversial idea. He suggests that maybe their failure was actually intentional, a kind of passive resistance. The theory is that deep down, the German physicists were basically sabotaging their own work because they didn't want to hand a nuclear weapon to someone like Hitler. And honestly, this is something historians still debate to this day. Otto Hahn, though, he just cuts right through all that debate. He doesn't buy the whole intentional failure argument for a second. For him, the reason didn't even matter. He was just profoundly, overwhelmingly grateful that they did not succeed. The failure of his country's project was, in a very real way, his own personal salvation. So what happens to a man like Otto Hahn? How do you live with a legacy like that, where you win the Nobel Prize for a discovery that also gives humanity its deadliest weapon? Well, he channeled all of that profound guilt into action. After he was released, Hahn went back to Germany, not just as a famous scientist, but as a powerful voice for peace. He used his immense prestige to campaign relentlessly against the nuclear arms race that his own discovery had helped create. And this post-war hope was perfectly captured by this single vessel. In 1964, West Germany launched the NS Otto Hahn, a nuclear-powered cargo ship. It was meant to be this potent symbol, a way to prove that the atom could be a tool for commerce and progress, not just for destruction. But that dream, it was pretty short-lived. The ship just wasn't a commercial success. After only 9 years, its nuclear reactor was ripped out and replaced with a normal diesel engine. Eventually, it was sold for scrap. Today, all that's left of this grand symbol of peaceful atomic power is its funnel sitting in a museum. It's kind of a poignant metaphor for a really complicated and maybe even failed ambition. In the end, this quote from those farm hall tapes really captures Hahn's ultimate feeling. Despite the Nobel Prize, despite all the awards, his greatest legacy, at least in his own mind, wasn't what he discovered. It was what he and his colleagues failed to build. And that relief, that was his only real comfort. So, Otto Hahn's story leaves us with a really tough question. He was a chemist. He was driven by pure curiosity, not by malice. He never, ever wanted to build a weapon. But in the end, does intent even matter? Can the pure pursuit of knowledge ever be truly separated from the consequences of that knowledge? It's a question that scientists and really all of us are still grappling with today.